Good evening. I'm Ed Gallagher, President of the American Scandinavian Foundation, and it's my very, very great pleasure to welcome you to our headquarters, Scandinavia House, for this, the keynote address by Mieke Bal, opening the conference which will be taking place tomorrow, entitled Marketing the North, a symposium which has been organized by the Munk Modernism and Modernity Network of Norway. This conference has been co-sponsored by the University of Oslo, the Munk Museum, the National Museum of Norway, and the American Scandinavian Foundation. Additional support has been provided by the Fritt Ord Foundation in Oslo. And tonight's symposium is presented also as a complement to the exhibition which has just opened in our third-floor galleries here at Scandinavia House, The Experimental Self, the photography of Edvard Munch. It's a particular pleasure for all of us here at ASF to be hosting this conference tonight. This is the 7th annual meeting organized by the Munk Modernism and Modernity group, and the first to be held outside of Oslo. The meeting brings together a distinguished group of scholars and curators from Scandinavia, the rest of Europe and North America, and I welcome you all. It's a great, great pleasure and honor to have you with us. Tomorrow's program promises to be a stimulating and revealing look at the many ways in which Nordic art achieved international recognition. I think it's particularly relevant to ASF, which in organizing the 1912 exhibition of Scandinavian art seen here in the United States and 4 other American cities, we played an important part, I think, in introducing a lot of Nordic art to this country, certainly. That exhibition included over 80 artists from the Nordic countries, and I think introduced many of them for the first time, including Edvard Munch. Since its incorporation in New York City in 1911, ASF has served as the premier cultural and educational link between the United States and the 5 Nordic countries: Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. It was the first international non-governmental society to have as its sole purpose the development of goodwill through the exchange of educational, professional, and cultural programming. That 1912 exhibition was the first major cultural effort by ASF and was followed in subsequent years by many others. Most memorably, perhaps for some people in this room, Scandinavia Today, a major national cultural manifestation with events in over a dozen US cities. ASF organized and coordinated this very ambitious festival, which included a number of memorable exhibitions, most notably perhaps Northern Light, which was curated by Kirk Varnish with the assistance of some people in this room, including Pat Berman. Many of us have fond memories of that exhibition, and it led in many ways to further activities on the part of the foundation. Today, ASF provides extensive fellowship, grant, and internship opportunities, as well as publications. We have a wide variety of educational and cultural activities which take place here at Scandinavia House, our headquarters. And over 2 million people have visited since we opened Scandinavia House in 2000. Here we offer films, concerts, lectures, children's events, and exhibitions. More than 60 exhibitions have been presented in the past 17 years, among them Luminous Modernism, which included works by many of the artists from the 1912 exhibition, as well as recent exhibitions Wilhelm Hammershøi from the collections of the Danish National Gallery, Munch Warhol and the Multiple Image, with which we partnered again with the Munk Museum, prints by Edvard Munch from the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, and most recently Independent Visions, Helene Scherfbeck and her contemporaries from Atheneum, the Finnish National Gallery. On Wednesday, we opened The Experimental Self, Edvard Munch's photography, which was organized by ASF in partnership with the Munk Museum in Oslo and curated by Patrice Berman. It's a fascinating exhibition and a wonderful complement to the current exhibition at the Met Breuer. I want to express my great thanks to Pat Berman for curating the exhibition, and she's been an actually absolutely fundamental part of our activities here for many years. And I am also especially grateful to Stein Olaf Henrickson and Jon Ove Steihaug of the Munk Museum for making the exhibition possible, as well as other lenders, Nelson Blitz and Catherine Woodard, and Trond and Joan Jensen. And we were also very fortunate in receiving financial support from many donors, including Trond Jensen, DNB Bank, and Inger and Bill Ginsberg. I'd now like to invite Stein Olaf Henrickson, director of the Munk Museum, and a most generous and helpful partner in organizing the exhibition, to the podium. Stein?
Thank you very much. It's a great honor, and I'm also very happy to join Ed Gallagher in inviting you and wishing you a warm welcome to this year's conference on Munk, Modernity, Modernism and Modernity, Marketing the North. This is an annual conference that happens for the first time outside of Norway, as Ed just mentioned, and I like to underline also that this is an ongoing collaboration with the University of Oslo and the National Museum and the Munk Museum. So we do this every year. The conference this year coincides with the Experimental Self exhibition here at the Scandinavia House of Munk's photos, and also another exhibition that is happening now at Met Breuer, which is Edvard Munch, Between the Clock and the Bed. So it was a very nice opportunity to be able to do the research conference this year in connection to these exhibitions. And also, in fact, we are announcing, or we did announce on Tuesday, the Edvard Munch Art Award. So in fact, we have had a full week of Munch activities in New York. I think it's a Munch week in New York this week. When Munch died in 1944, as most of you know, he had already testamented his whole collection to the city of Oslo. And that was almost 2/3 of his entire production, 28,000 artworks, 15,000 other museum objects, and also almost 15,000 pages of texts. So we have a very, very wide collection connected to Edvard Munch and his life and works. This is a very huge responsibility, certainly, because we know that Munch means a lot to a lot of people all over the world, and there is a lot of attention on our artist, and we need to be able to take that responsibility for our artist. And in fact, next week I'm going to a conference for monographic museums, because we have a lot in common when we are dealing with one artist rather than a wide range of artists, which a lot of museums, as you know, also have to do. This means we have to have a strategy for how we develop interest and knowledge about our artists all over the world. We receive almost 60 invitations from museums every year all over the world, which is absolutely all over the world, that wants to have a Munch exhibition, and certainly we cannot meet that request, but we can try to be out there as much as possible, and as you know, this week we are in New York. And another thing that we are doing is digitalizing the collection, so it's going to be more easy approachable for people all over the world. And we are also trying now to inspire and invest in having publications given out in all languages and in different countries. So it's a lot of things that we are doing in order to emphasize and inspire more knowledge and interest in our artist Edvard Munch. Of course, research is on the core of this activity, and that's why we are very happy to have the collaboration with the University of Oslo and also with our friends at the National Museum. But in fact, we're having a lot of collaborations also in terms of science and research with institutions from basically all over the world. And this is something that we want to further develop, certainly. So I'm very happy to see you all here, and I would very much like to thank the American Scandinavian Foundation for having us here. Thank you very much, Ed Gallagher. We have had a very nice and very fruitful and valuable friendship for many years now. I remember standing here. Last time I was standing here was when we had a smaller research day connected to the Munch Warhol exhibition that was in 2013, and that was very popular, and even went to Ankara together with the first state visit to Turkey after the crusade. You didn't get that, okay. And I really hope that this conference will be inspiring and fruitful and valuable to all of you. And I wish you good luck on the very important work that you are doing, participating in this conference. And then it's also a big pleasure for me to introduce Patrice Berman, who is not only the organizer and the let's say leader of the working committee that is designing this program for the conference, but is also a very dedicated Munch researcher that we have a lot of interaction with, and who is inspiring us at the Munch Museum with her dedication to our artists and also her very deep knowledge of our artists. So with that, I wish you all a good conference, and please, Patrice Berman, take the floor. Thank you very much.
You know how very often when you go to the cinema, there are a number of short films and commercials before the main event, so we're all thanking each other. But I do want to say, on behalf of the Munch Modernism and Modernity Research Group, what a pleasure it is to hold our 7th annual conference here at Scandinavia House here in New York. Our research group consists of the following people whom you'll meet tomorrow in various capacities. May-Britt Gulang and Øystein Østved of the National Museum in Oslo, Jan-Uwe Steihaug, who you'll meet in just a moment, and Ute Kuleman Falk of the Munch Museum, Øystein Sjostad, and Øyvind Storm-Bjerke of the University of Oslo, and I get to be their international partner. I'm honored with that. Each year, we organize a conference that places Edvard Munch within a larger critical frame. We ask a question each year that includes Munch, but hopes each year to engage some new scholarship, questions about the social and cultural issues of Munch's day. We hope to mentor students, and we hope to expand the conversations about art, material culture, history, and criticism circulating around Munch. Our process each year is to send out a call for papers from which we compose our conference, and we invite keynote speakers whose work we see as fundamental to our research and our annual questions. And this year we have with the pleasure of welcoming 2 keynote speakers, Mieke Bal, whom you'll meet in a moment, and Robert Jensen, who will be speaking tomorrow morning. We also have a host of speakers from 7 countries joining us this weekend. I too wish to thank Ed Gallagher, the Munch Museum, the University of Oslo, the National Museum, and Fritt Ord for the extraordinary ability to migrate from Oslo to New York this year. And it's also my pleasure to welcome one of our research partners, Jan-Uwe Steihaug, who will in turn will introduce, finally, Mieke Bal. Thank you.
Thank you. So next one is you, Mieke. Just prepare. My name is Jan-Uwe Steihaug, and I'm Director of Exhibitions and Collections at the Munch Museum. And it's great to be here at Scandinavia House and with the exhibition about Met Breuer. So yeah, there is definitely a Munch week this week. Mieke Bal, I became familiar with her work in the early 90s, which was especially a book called Reading Rembrandt, which was a big revelation, not only for me, but for many people in art history. Mieke she's not an art history from the start. She made a name for herself in the field of narratology in literature. And then she, in a way, migrated out or made her way into other disciplines like semiotics, Bible studies, many different fields, and also art history. So she, in fact, became part of what was in the 90s called new art history, which was really exciting. And she has continued this cross-disciplinary practice as an academic. She started a center at the University of Amsterdam called ASCA, Amsterdam School of Cultural Analysis. And she's also been part of the academic field of visual studies, which is today a very important, I would say, a subfield, but also sort of a little bit independent of art history. So Mieke is a wonderful thinker and theoretician and academic, and also very generous. And she had also made a name for herself in art history, and we thought at the Munk Museum that it would be really interesting to invite Mieke to look at Munk, and we will hear her talk about Munk tonight. But earlier this year, she also curated a show at the Munk Museum, actually, called Emma and Edvard. And that was a highly experimental exhibition. It was a kind of pairing of Mieke's choice of works by Munk, and then at the same time showing her own film video installation called Madame B, which is a kind of remake or a take on Madame Bovary of Flaubert. And this was a great meeting on many levels between Mieke and Munk, and also Flaubert and Munk, and it went in many directions. And she also wrote a substantial book together with this exhibition called Emma and Edvard, Looking Sideways, Loneliness, and the Cinematic. So this means that Mieke has already, we managed, and we were really happy to get Mieke to be, investigate Munk. And she became really fascinated, I think. And then, so that is sort of the background for this evening's talk. So in a way, you're just following up on what you've already started to present new ways of thinking about Munk, and sort of coming a little bit from the outside, and then turning Munk a little bit upside down. I hope you'll still continue to do that. So welcome to the floor, Mieke.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to climb on a chair. I don't like to stand for an hour. I'm sure not many people like that. Okay, so it's a bit clumsy, but here I am. Hello. Nice to see you all. I'm glad with this big turnout, and it's a great honor for me to give this opening lecture, and I feel totally privileged and honored to be invited to do that. Thank you, Patricia. I'm going to do this lecture as well as I can, of course, and if there are technical terms that I use, I try not to do that, but if I do, just wave and I'll explain them if you don't know them. Okay, here we go. I thought I should stick to the theme, but it's difficult for me because it's totally alien theme for me. But thank Patricia for this wonderful image. It also tells you what I think of this. Okay, this is different. Just one painting among so many. Not one of those well-known masterpieces, although it is getting there. It's very well known, but I fear for a different reason, because it is so Nordic, in a nearly cliché manner. Snow, isn't that what the North is all about? Precisely because it is both well known, and I suspect due to the theme of snow, among other reasons, it is not one of those emblematic paintings. It's not just the screen, it's not up there with the screen. For which Japanese and other world tourists flock to the Munk Museum. But precisely because it's not, this painting will guide us through my attempt to or demarket Munk. Because that's my goal. I'm an anti-capitalist, don't tell anyone. I used to like and admire this painting a lot. Its cute subject matter cannot hide that it harbors so many of what makes Munk a truly modern artist, experimenting with what painting as an art can be at a time when realistic, or as it was called in Norway, naturalistic, painting had become too scholastic. What endeared me to it is not the snow, that feature that makes it suitable for Christmas cards, and that in such a context makes all the rest of it invisible. This is my argument about this kind of popularity. It is the way it murmurs against marketing, both of Munk with his somewhat dubious reputation, that is actually totally exploited in the otherwise wonderful exhibition at the Met Breuer, but I have a serious problem with the captions there. It is also, and I also want to demarket the North as a Christmas card in itself. Both reputations are wrong and blinding. My talk proposes 3 steps. 1, taking this painting as a starting point is an attempt at liberating Munk both from his reputation and from chronology, the chronology that subtends it. The second is zooming in on images of drinking and then out of that cliché thematic biographical topos in an attempt at deepening our insight in Munk's modernity as what I call a surface tension. And then third, I will end, but briefly, on a plea for alleging Munk in his radical modernity as a political artist in a sense that I will specify. At first sight, looking at the composition, I see this. The people, supposedly children, walking out of the frame. The unreadable faces, just one flat and one 3D triangle. The steep perspective, also emphatically triangular, with its vanishing point too neatly in the center of the picture's surface to be convincing realistically. These are elements of Munk's brilliant way of making paintings moving. It is one of 2 modes of his conception and expression of modernity. This quality, which I have called cinematic, makes more rather than less of the medium in relation to reality. And that is going to be my concluding section. But in a different medium, a different reality, and a different relationship between the two than just depiction. In the exhibition that I had the profound pleasure of curating at the Munk Museum, an opportunity for which I will forever be deeply grateful to the monkeys. Now, this may be one of those technical terms. You understand that this is an affectionate term for the lovely people who have this talent for dedication to Munk, intelligence, creativity, and friendship. Okay, so in this exhibition, I have presented this cinematic quality in the first instance through the painting that is famous for it, Workers on Their Way Home. This painting, one of those emblematic Munks, so incisively commented on by Gerd Wall in her inspiring scholarship, and I'm very, very honored that she's here tonight, and also by Arne Eggum and many others. This painting shows, on the bottom right of the 3 takes, also a figure, the bottom left. No, on the bottom right. A figure walking out of the frame, like the figures in Snow Falling on the Lane. But once we see that cinematic quality, which is well known, something else appears. On the left, on the far left, there is a shadow of less than half a figure, leaving the frame as an after image. Here you see it. I only saw this when the painting was installed for my exhibition. I had never seen it. The semi-transparency of the paint strokes emphasizes this movement and thus complicates and makes more of the cinematic quality of the painting. It stipulates that showing movement is not enough. It is the sequential nature of the movement that makes the painting time-based and therefore truly cinematic. And for that effect, the shadowy, semi-erased after image is indispensable. 2 of the 3 main figures stand still as if in freeze frame for the camera. But the 3rd on the right moves on, while this shadowy figure on the left is already gone, yet still visible. Now, the figures walking out of the frame in Snow Falling in the Lane, emphasizing the exaggeratedly steep perspective as triangular as their faces, which make for a decidedly cinematic iconography, if such a thing exists at all. One that Munk deployed frequently as his own invention. It had provoked me to come up with a cinematic curation. And this not only to justify, as well as foreground, as I felt I had to, the combination of Munk's paintings with our video installations, Madame B, in turn based on Flaubert's cinematic writing. And Flaubert was pre-cinema, but he wrote cinematically, and that's sort of a recognized feature of his writing. I was thus integrating 3 different media, or art forms, which I did through a focus on the unorthodoxies in the 3 works, mustering what the standard viewer would consider mistakes. To justify this in Munk's own home, so to speak, the Munk Museum, alleging his interest in the emerging cinema and in photography and in writing, did not seem enough. Since he was before all a painter and a graphic artist, I wanted to tease out of his still images the cinematic and indirectly the literary qualities, and thus intimate that Munk the painter is, so to speak, a multimedia artist. And not just because he did these different graphics and drawing and in addition to painting, but in each image, he is a multimedia artist. Now, with this purpose, I made 2 imaginary oblique crossing lines in one of the galleries, one making Munk's brilliant and poignant Wedding of the Bohemian, which became the poster image of the exhibition, resonate with Emma Bovary's Wedding to suggest that Munk's, as well as Flaubert's, infamous misogyny must be qualified in view of the profoundly empathic intimation of loneliness on the woman's supposedly happiest day of her life, which is what weddings are supposed to be, according to that institution's wrong reputation. The ideology of marriage needs to be qualified as much as Munk's vision of women. The other oblique line consisted of placing on one side of the gallery kissing couples in the park with a decidedly deceptively cheerful title, and so beware of Munk's title. He can really cheat. That shows as its focal figure, instead of the penguin-like, unreadable couples supposedly kissing, the lonely woman running away from the scene since she has no one to kiss. Across that other figure running away, across from her, that other figure running away out of the frame, this one in horror. Again, the peaceful, superbly irrelevant title, Red Virginia Creeper, is just telling us not to take titles literally, for they may distract us from what we see. And that, I contend, is what Munk is doing. So in a sense, he's a poet in his titles, putting you on the wrong foot. Making us aware of the primacy of looking, the need to see what is there. Is it a creeper, plant, or flames? And he's not giving the answer. Instead of reading titles, biographical information, or other documentation that is literally beside the point in both these paintings, there is something odd about the perspective, the lane curling into nothingness, and the background unreadable in terms of what the title promises. But most forcefully striking, the main figures leaving the frame, now in this curatorial interventions, running toward each other. And of course, they weren't conceived for that. But the cinematic is not enough to account for Munk's unique modernity. For there is more to the relatively simple painting that I have chosen as my starting point, if only because it lends itself, but so utterly deceptively, that the very idea blinds us to marketing the North. How cute and cozy, that snow. But then the awkward way the trees melt together where their crowns meet, suddenly seeming ghosts. That strange, oversized red ball on the left, where the falling snowflakes implausibly turned gray, then black. And the white dots or spots that we cannot make out, however much I try to blow up that portion of the image. Everything that makes the painting strange, makes it intriguing enough to ponder. What kind of painting is this? In 1906, the time that Picasso, still firmly immersed in his rather sentimental pink period, was about to begin experimenting with what later becomes Cubism. The snowflakes, how easily do we assume that that is what they are? Those tiny white dots or spots, depending on how we see the surface. Of course, the title guides us, but in fact misguides us, and that Munk does almost systematically. My primary point is this. Munk will not declare himself a partisan of one side of an opposition, here the one between figuration and abstraction, dots as figurations of snowflakes, or spots as marks on the surface. Who's to say? Marks, like those traces behind the figures that could be footprints moving in the opposite direction of an animal, here blown up on the upper right of the slide. Or they could be stains, traces of the painter at work, or the effect of his willfully negligent behavior towards his canvases. Yes, this happened later, but who is to say? Just today we were discussing how his earliest work has already this sort of tension. Here's where I want to bring in another reason for keeping biography and the reputation it contaminates at bay. The problematic guidance from chronology, which can make us blind as well. And for this, I'm going to make an outrageous, preposterous leap across time to 2014. As marks on the surface that function as what a century later Indian artist Nalini Malani would call agitations on the surface. She makes wall drawings that she then erases. She's currently in an exhibition in the Centre Pompidou where she also did that. She has it erased by museum staff and public. And she calls that erasure performances. And those erasure performances could be seen in continuity with what Munk famously did to his paintings by leaving them outside to invite the elements to participate. This view is, of course, anachronistic. Anachronism has been advocated as a productive view of art, connecting the past to the present, or the present to the past. I consider it a figure of thought and call it preposterous history. That is the name I gave it some years before Georges Didi Uberman proposed a more common term, anachronism, that, I'm sorry to say, flattens it a little bit. As Alison Moorhead recently wrote, Didi Uberman proposed to revisit Nietzsche via Foucault to justify his use of anachronism. I'm quoting from Alison. The idea of anachronism as a starting point for a different kind of history is not as alien to Munk as one might imagine. Its genealogy, as Didi Uberman points out, includes Michel Foucault's writing on Friedrich Nietzsche, whose philosophy was critical to Munk's Berlin circle in the early 1890s. Now, this statement is right, of course. There's nothing wrong with it. But it is paradoxical, justifying a reversal of chronology by an appeal to chronology. When I noticed his appeal to prestigious predecessors and his lack of engagement with the scholarly work of contemporary colleagues, my intuition was that Didi Uberman was going to be as conservative as any chronology-addicted art historian in his progressive gesture. And so it seems, for his anachronisms don't specify how that thinking and seeing across time works, how it transforms the older work. That is why I prefer to speak of interhistorical rather than and intertemporal rather than transhistorical, as is now quite fashionable. Between, in a relationship to be specified, Cézanne's curved perspective that emphasizes the presence of the viewer, and Marlene Dumas' presentation of perspective as a mind block in this incredible painting, very untypical of Dumas, Munk's use of perspective is calling up phantoms of other times. So, if I may, ironically, do a bit of chronology, just to show that I can do it too, I have proposed a slightly different term, preposterous, meaning both literally the reversal of pre and post, so that what came after now becomes a predecessor of sorts, And figuratively, the sneer, that's preposterous, that I've had a lot, meaning that what the speaker is supposedly disparaging is bold, out of line, improper, like Munk and Flaubert's mistakes. I am unironically committed to the idea that we cannot see old master art without seeing it through the screen of later responses to it, and that we take historicity seriously, so that this screen needs to be accounted for when we describe what we see. So you cannot pretend that you're transparently looking at the past, because you cannot. Thus, I cannot see Munk's snowflakes without seeing Malani's erasure performances, and hence privileging the spots over the dots interpretation without obliterating the latter. So it's not only snowflakes, not only dots, but it's also spots. Michael and Holly wrote about this need for a double look at art's way of predicting its responses already in 1990, and Svetlana Alpers and Michael Baxendal wrote it about old art and later art in their book on Tiepolo from 1994. With my term preposterous, I also like to keep that touch of outrageousness in view. I am, of course, alleging a chronology here, tongue-in-cheek, ironically, partly to counter a hypothesis of anachronism on the basis of prestigious precedents, which is what Didier Roman in the end is doing, and partly, more importantly, to intimate the need to do more than just reversing time. What I would like to take from Malani's spots as a preposterous key to Munk's snowflakes is the attention to agitation on the surface. Munk was a master of ambiguity of the surface, but not simply as a formal ploy. The intertemporal dialogue yields a stronger view of the meaning of erasure, which for Malani is a critique of the waste of negligence, and at the same time the ineradicable presence of the past in the presence, of which the figure of the spectre is the metaphor. Through a look at some remarkable instances where the surface struggles with the figurative topic of the paintings, I want to make the case, preposterous or not, that Munk is bolder, and I would add more searching, than the French Cubists, Fauvists, or others who have been claimed as his inspirations. Since this conference is devoted to marketing the North, I allow myself to express a heartfelt regret concerning what that topic must also bring up. I was quite fond of Falling Snow in the Lane, of that painting, but I had not bothered with it in my exhibition, nor in the book that accompanied it. I didn't even choose to include the scream, although I could easily have done that because there is a scene where Emma screams. What spoiled both for me was that they had been marketed, overwritten by capitalist abuse, and thus transformed into trash, joining other such trash. How can a visitor ever look at the scream again after being pushed through the museum shop before entering the exhibition space? An architecture of marketing now standard in museums all over the world. You must really feel ambivalent or even hate your baby, wishing Munk's loneliness upon him or her, to dress them in one of those suits, isn't it? Would you ever put that on your baby? Moreover, it's just the enduring effect of repetition as erasure, which also made Van Gogh's Sunflowers so unbearable. Now, I want to show this surface tension as Munk's modernity in a more positive way. You'll be happy to hear. So let me resist that marketing and instead consider why Munk doesn't need such capitalist energies, nor does the North for that matter. Munk's modernity, which can gloriously compete with the best, most famous French innovators, I situate in his discussions on and off the surface, that primary element of painting, responding maybe to Clement Greenberg. It is the tension he creates that ultimately is the source of movement in his work. One of the excellent Munk scholars, Paul Erik Teuner, wrote this about the surface. Munk is saved by his belief in the surface. There can hardly be any doubt that it is the depth. Is the quote there? Yeah. That it is the depth rather than the surface which destroy the terrible abyss. One is stifled, one loses everything, one perishes, one drowns. One becomes invisible, one falls, and, probably worst of all, nobody notices. This is a commentary on surface and depth. Now, especially the final indictment of visual indifference, nobody notices, seems such an apt commentary on Munk's poignant, compassionate, and critical painting Drowning Child, where indifferent bystanders fail to witness and hence allow the child to die. This painting shows a brilliant tension between figuration and abstraction, where the abstraction on the wall of the pier stands for the wall of indifference. I don't have time to go into the detail of it, which I did in my book, but it is an amazing, this wall is the wall of the pier, and it's completely abstract. I now want to further pursue the surface tension, the tension between figuration and abstraction, which rejects both and most forcefully the binary opposition between the two. This rejection lured even such an excellent Munch scholar as Elizabeth Prelinger to write that, unlike such contemporaries as Picasso or Matisse, Munch was not part of the vanguard. In a world of abstraction, surrealism, and other advanced trends, he remained committed to a more traditional, if personal, version of figurativism based upon expressionism and fauvism. Now, this is a typical quote, and not to disparage this wonderful critic, but in this quote, I think what she overlooks is that Munch was never really part of anything. He was not a movement guy. This makes him more vanguard or radical, innovatively modern, rather than less. The words remained and more traditional dismiss the surface tension Munch created as a radical intervention in what painting is and can do. I don't think marketing the North requires comparing to the South, with negative conclusions for the North if the two don't match. To make the case, I alleged some paintings I had curated in my exhibition to form a drinking corner with a lot of inspiration from Ute Falk in these decisions. Hence a representation of one of Munch's biographical problems, only to take these paintings away from that obsessive biographism. So here's the drinking corner. Cozy, huh? If Munch painted these works with such an ambivalent emphasis on hands, we must not jump to the conclusion that these are about his drinking problem. Why would hands be about your... No, there's no reason. Especially the most hand-oriented one, hand reaching out for bottles on the bottom right here, dates from around 1938, long after Munch had stopped drinking. But hands are also the primary tool of painting. Moreover, at this point, Munch has lost the use of his left hand, as incidentally had Flaubert, due to his father, who made a mistake as a surgeon, and as also, and Flaubert, of course, also as a writer needed his hand. And before both, the inventor of another kind of modern art, Miguel de Cervantes, author of Don Quixote. This gives the hand another biography-based force, but one where the accidents of life join the professional artistic endeavor. Here are some of Munch's hands. More relevant than whether or not Munch drank too much at certain periods of his life is his reputation that he was bad, clumsy at painting hands. Look at those hands. True, they can be shapeless, flat flaps. This, however, is the location of the surface tension that makes Munch's painting so uniquely modern. The clumsiness of hands is purposeful. Of these examples, two hands are more sophisticated, and that shows that he could do better. The upper left one is clearly the best. The clenched, that's this from this painting. Look at here. This is a really sophisticated, tense hand. The clenched fist comes from the painting that allegedly commemorates the loss of his hand. If he was trying to naturalistically raise compassion, he would have painted the hand as destroyed. And on the lower left, outreaching is the outreaching hand, a detail as well as the center of an image. And this is a depiction not of the temptation of alcohol, but of the tension between figuration and abstraction. A mise en abîme of what Munk's painting is trying to achieve. If you see this hand, you know that you're not into any clumsiness by lack of skill. This hand is depicted in more detail than the other ones I showed. The fingers are outlined on two superimposed surfaces, the one with the thumb and the hand as a whole, and then over that, the fingers. The green outlines do not follow the red substance, but create a color field where the two complementary colors, which together create mass and movement in a vibrant interaction, are juxtaposed against the background of the part that is only green, a third surface. There's even a shadow of the index finger in brighter red, as if to hint at yet another layer, potential layer. These layers suggest that surfaces matter. I see the hand in that small painting as an indication that figuration and abstraction must be kept together, not as life and art, but as readable and unreadable entrances into the surface of painting. This hand is different from the one in the full painting, of which it only seems to be a detail, the one here on the bottom left. It is more strongly foreshortened. It's not at all the same, it's not a copy. What is foreshortening other than affirming as well as challenging the flatness of the image, the fact that the spatial effect is just an effect. That's what foreshortening is. The middle right side hands came from another 1906 painting. There, the patch of ochre and black, supposedly a hand belonging to the man with the white overpainted face, supposedly Munk himself, cannot for the life of me be seen as a depiction of hands. The only hands recognizable as hands are clearly and thus violently cut off from their ostensive owner's arms. How bizarre. This painting has been placed in continuity with Munk's engagement with the Christiania Bohemia scene in his younger years. Sketches serve to identify each person at the table, including Munk's feelings about those persons. An example of that kind of realist biographical reading is an essay by Peter Krieger from 1978, who identified each person at the table with reference to an 1895 pencil and oil sketch, including how Munk felt about each of the people. But Krieger's meticulous reading is blind to the fact that these hands are separated from a body. I haven't seen any criticism that mentions that. For Krieger, the relevant fact is that it is Jappe Nielsen reaching for a glass. Is that fragment of a figure on the far right, of whom we only see half the face with a red nose and a high curved brow, what I see as a frightened expression, is that really reaching for a glass? It's rather holding off. If anything, the left hand is covering the glass as if refusing a refill. Instead, I see those clumsy hands as indicators of surface tension. Like snow falling in the lane, Drinkers of the same year is not such a famous painting. But in the same year, Munk painted his masterpiece, the most poignant expression of loneliness in modern art. And I apologize to those who have read my book that they are going to get a little bit of repetition here. But since the painting is also in the Matt Breuer exhibition, and I still find it incredibly moving. Here, the notion of the self-portrait, that most intimate expression of figuration, cannot be denied. On the contrary, it is precisely because this painting is such a beautiful, figurative and expressive painting that it seems the best case for what I call surface tension. All scholars I have read comment on the deep loneliness and many on the interlocking slack hands. I quote one of the best and most detailed comments by Iris Müller-Westermann, also because she notices that feature this painting has in common with snow falling on the lane, the exaggerated perspective. She writes, "Few artists have so radically and honestly exposed their weaknesses to view, publicly portraying their loss of control over themselves. Munk sits in the foreground of a sharply receding picture space, hemmed in between two rows of tables. The head is the center of the picture, all other lines converging on it like a vanishing point. While his posture indicates weakness, his hands are clasped helplessly together. His head is placed against a red background and conveys inner turmoil." Now, like most comments, she focuses on what in the space, the colors, the outlines, enhances, produces the loneliness of the figure. And that comment hits the nail on the head. I have no quarrel with it. The rows of tables depicted with the Munchian exaggerated perspective make the figure seem hemmed in, indeed, and the color creates an inner turbulence. The fiery red portion behind the figure's head can hint at a fireplace and the curved orange shape on its left as at a decoration on of the wallpaper, which is part green, part orange. The red behind the head corresponds with the red tie, nice compositional feature, binding the figure to the fire. All this makes total sense. It all converges on the figure, his psychology, and his suffering. It helps to make us compassionate witnesses. But I wonder if it quite does justice to this work of painting. It is appealing to continue such a detailed analysis and focus, for example, on the inward-directed gaze of the eyes and the strange two men, waiters, so to speak, perhaps, looking like death, who stand behind back to back, in a flat surface reading. They come out of the figure's shoulders, shaping by contrast the togetherness that he lacks. Or they can figure a split personality. I've also read that in a biographical interpretation. Their backs turn to each other. Their small scale is due to the perspectival exaggeration. The small figure on the right in the background could be an old woman, an ominous, threatening presence that makes the loneliness worse because the man is lonely but not alone. The dejected body posture also indicates hopelessness. But I would like to leave it at this without diminishing its importance. On the contrary, I think it is really important to see all these indications and draw attention to other aspects that can help us make sense of the work beyond the compassionate sense of witnessing. Not to take that away, just to add to it. As Patrice Berman noticed in a private email, the wine glass in the right foreground leans slightly inwards toward the seated figure, vectoring away from the painting's frame, and thus indicated its importance. It has its own perspective, drawing attention to that illusory ploy of perspective. The space between that glass and the inert, paddle-like hands adds almost invisibly to the pathos of the image. And then there is the brushwork and the color composition. The man's suit is green and black, a worked-up surface that makes the fabric seems to move and the sagging shoulders more static in comparison. This further complicates the flatness figuration dynamic. The orange behind the chair makes no figurative sense other than being fiery, hence a potential bearer of inner turmoil. But the chair doesn't have that turmoil, so that's a bit strange. The tablecloths are clearly meant to be white, but there's barely any white among the nuances of blue. And then there are those hands. The point of their togetherness is to be slack, useless, both central and eccentric. Here the hands are at the front of that perspective, touching the tablecloth, so as to slightly curve its lower edge. The hands serve no figurative purpose in any of these paintings, and that may well be to express how color field preempts the figurative energy we tend to bring to this depiction of limpness. The best approach to this painting is to give up the distinction, let alone the opposition between figuration and abstraction. The tablecloths should make us realize that this is an invitation to look abstractly. Only if we dare overcome the predominance of a sentimental compassion can we see a source of anxiety in the absurdly non-figurative orange field behind the back of the chair, rather than in the dejected face. In surface tension, the figure sits on a color field, orange with nuances of brown that bring it to life. Either that, or he's actually burning. And I had another, when I went to the Breuer, I had this association also. Fire, orange in Munk, participates in the most intense conflation, integration of abstraction with meaning. And this brings me back to what Turner called plumbing the depths of superficiality, and what Juliana Bruno analyzes in her chapter Depth of Surface, in her book Surface. I want to make a case for Munk as artistically radical in terms of the centrality of abstraction in his work on the surface, as well as, but no, simply as, political. And I must keep this section short on the danger of boring you, so I have developed it more in more depth, so to speak, throughout my book, Emma and Edward. So this is my last section. When juxtaposed, these two paintings concern empathy, a politics of sociality. Munk's self-exposure and the universalizing statement on loneliness pair well with the compassionate wedding of the Bohemian. Both paintings solicit compassion. And my statement against the reputation of misogyny is embedded in this wedding painting. Beginning with the photographic mistake, there's that appearance of a flashlight behind the bride, between her and the alleged groom. How bizarre. This makes no sense. And the clumsily painted hand stretching out towards us. Here we go again. This is the middle bottom one. Let me bring then in these monstrous hands, which demonstrate again that painting hands clumsily is a meaningful gesture, and juxtapose them to those modesty-expressing hands in the perhaps fearful, perhaps boldly complicit young girl who stares at the viewer, so much better depicted, these hands. I'm interested in the intersection, the tension, the collaboration of compassionate figuration with radical, innovative abstraction that is not depiction's opposite. I propose 3 points, all related to the abstraction of brushstrokes, other surface aspects, such as spots, and the play with exaggerated perspective, realist and anti-realist. And so I will allege, here's a technical term for you, what linguistics has termed deixis, the use of semantically void but embodied words such as I and you, which only makes sense in the presence of utterance, staging the anachronism of our relationship to art. We can only see it in the present, and that is deictic temporality. Deixis is an index, a pointer, that is locked in, key to the subject. Such is the viewing point. Deixis is spatial and bodily. It is anchored in the actively looking or speaking body. The subject shapes what she sees from within the experience of self. And then the self returns the images that have entered it from the outside. So what you see is what you have seen, and then you see it outside. These images returned to sender are now thickened and specified by affective commentary or feeling. And these indexes mediate between deixis, there is smoke, and another kind of index, causal, hence there must be fire. You know that very famous example. That well-known example demonstrates distinction while nicely relating to Munk's self-portrait. Change smoke to orange and you have it. The color is deictic, for it is what makes us see the fire behind the figure, already affecting the chair he sits on. This bodily conception of deixis, is that term clear enough? It's like words that in the dictionary wouldn't make any sense. I or you, or today, yesterday, tomorrow, that only makes sense compared to the here and now. This bodily conception of deixis can clarify color perspective, where black and white or dark and bright create three-dimensionality in the flat plane. Scale and color work together to achieve this alternative form of perspective. The blue-white tablecloth press the brooding figure to the edge of the picture plane, almost pushing him out, alluding to the lens of the camera and to our role as viewers. I see such cropping as a suspension of the traditional linear perspective and the illusion of spatial wholeness and possessiveness it entails. Traditional perspective, linear perspective goes backwards and this comes forward. And since perspective is essentially a tool for representation, this is another bridge over the alleged gap between figuration and abstraction. Munk does both together. The dark green that suggests the man's suit is also a dark color that presses him backwards into the fire, yet also, due to the cropping, forwards into our arms. Something similar happens at the lower edge of the equally sad Wedding of the Bohemian, where the place of the viewer is carved in slightly darker abstraction. Instead of delivering space for the encompassing eye, color perspective prods objects for the touch. In this view, white pushes forwards and black draws backwards. The master of that kind of color perspective is Caravaggio. But that's for another talk. As a result, perspective in the self-portrait becomes an inflection and emulation of linear perspective, transforming perspective's meaning from possession to relationality, I, you. Thus, depth become volume does not lead the eye away to the vanishing point, but forward to the viewer herself. Hence, the sense that the figure is pushed towards us, very close, almost falling into our arms. And differently, but through the same device, from the front of the wedding, a straight line connects us to the far removed bride. She's all the way at the far end. Another aspect of abstraction is inattention. This old idea goes back to the 17th century, has come to renewed attention in terms of modernity via Walter Benjamin in a study by Jonathan Crary from 2000. Abstraction in this sense is a lack of attention. The paradoxical consequence is a distraction from the motif towards its painterly realization. This figural distraction leads away from a sentimentalizing compassion, which in turn is conducive to an ethical indifference because we can't help. And there are some references here for both these issues. An ethical indifference is one of the terms that are very important here. And this opens us up to a more embodied material empathy. It leads us to attention to the paint, to materiality. If I now combine these forms of abstraction to look again at the emblematic painting of compassion, the self-portrait with a bottle of wine, again deceptively titled, the patch of orange behind the figure is doing it all. Working by color relation, orange as related to, complementary of, yet firmly distinguished from the brown of the chair and the green of the suit, it literally destroys the otherwise neat, albeit exaggerated perspective. It distracts from the dejected figure, thus enticing us to inattention. Then in a realization of what we do, giving up on compassion and looking at the color patch instead. You have to realize that you do that. And once concentrated on that patch, precisely because it eats into the chair, it becomes a clear figuration of fire. From color alone, through allusion, the abstract orange becomes not a figuration, but a sign. Where there is orange, there is fire. Yet, at the same time, the orange remains just that, a patch of color. This makes Munk more or differently advanced than his contemporaries and the trends they work in, proposing not a style, but a continuous experimental mobile mode of painting. The orange remaining pigment, while signifying fire, is so meaningful because fire also hovers between thing and event. It's an example in the speech act theory of language that Austin created, that fire is an event and a thing at the same time, thus bringing in the ambiguity between duration and instantaneousness. I consider this patch of orange an emblem, a mise en abîme of Munk's painting. And this signification process does not lift the thing out of its materiality. The importance of matter lies in its active participation in reality, the reality we call material. Matter partakes of the real existence of the world that reassures us because it is our habitat. And this is precisely why matter matters. It helps and even forces us to deal with the world on its own terms. In deictic looking in this I-you interaction, matter is our second person. But deixis is mutual, it's reversible. Hence, necessarily, logically and materially, we take turns when we become its second person, letting it speak in the first person. This is how, after having been distracted from the sad figure and diverting our gaze to the orange patch, we then look from the one to the other. And then the compassion is anchored in the material world. The durational, interiorized gaze and the instantaneousness of the fire both come to us through the materiality of pigment. The brushstrokes and colors become the work's first person. We finally manage to look figuration and abstraction together in the eye. This allows me to wind up on a view of abstraction, as emblematically demonstrated in the foreground of this painting of utter desolation, where the place of the viewer in the abstract drippings and absurdly meaningless curves invite us to assign to the lonely woman the position of first person. She's not an object, she's a subject. This view of abstraction is derived from Gilles Deleuze and lucidly articulated by New York-based philosopher John Weisman. It enables us to assign a political agency to abstraction. Abstraction, according to Deleuze and Guattari in 1,000 Plateaus, and I contend according to Munk, is not turning away from the world, nor construing it as the opposite of art. On the contrary, and here I quote Weisman, "For this world is what abstraction is all about. Abstraction as the attempt to show in thought as in art, in sensation as in concept, the odd, multiple, unpredictable potential in the midst of things, of other new things, other new mixtures." An important feature of this view is that abstraction works with intensity rather than expression. Intense means that the work is bristling, hence moving, with unknown and unseen possibilities. And that's where the agency of the viewer comes into picture. These emanate from the work to the viewer and invite mutuality. They are by definition relational. Only when one is blind to the habitual is one able to suspend already known forms, this disease of recognizing things in paintings. This points to and stretches the limits of the visual. The focus on intensity is displaced from what the work emanates to the viewer's experience and co-making of it. The latter inflection, reconsideration, active engagement, and remaking of the intensity. For Weisman, blindness is a necessary condition for seeing the surface. One must become blind enough to see the surface as mixed or assembled in a particular transformable and deformable manner rather than as just flat, he says. Now, I cannot imagine a more adequate articulation of Munk's unique integration of figuration and abstraction. Equally important and sometimes, as in those spots or dots, even interchangeable. If you can confuse an abstraction, orange, with, and take it for, a figuration, fire, then you are blind enough to be facing the surface. And only then can we make sense of the political, as described by philosopher Wendy Brown. Politics refers always to a condition of plurality and difference, to the human capacity for producing a world of meanings, practices and institutions, and to the constant implication of power among us, its generation, distribution, circulation, and effects. End of quote. It is not by following trends, market-oriented or not, looking at Northern art in emulation of Central French art, but by staying stubbornly creative, that Munk was able to invent a whole new way of keeping the surface tension going that political art requires. Just look one more time at this simple, utterly marketable, because seemingly unremarkable painting, with its specters of the past above or as the vanishing point, and see your own place as where the figures are moving towards, and then you realize its potential. Thank you.
Mieke, thank you for that extraordinary lecture and the awakening of recognition that you constantly ask us to, in which to participate. One of the things that was it's so striking about the work that you do and the work that you've brought to us in terms of a revisitation of Munk's work is to remind us not just of the way in which chronology forestalls our ability to see what, but chronology as implicated in biography, as implicated in this one man's totalizing story. And the totalizing story, I think, as you've pointed out a couple of different times this evening, sometimes disables our ability to see paintings, as inventions, or prints as inventions. We keep seeing Munk as a sequence of motifs, and because the motifs seem so familiar through variation, sometimes that we don't look anymore. So I really want to thank you for that attention both to materiality but also to the kind of entanglements that materiality offers us in terms of our own understanding and our own sense of self in relation to the subject. I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about surface tension, because I think it's a really important idea, both in terms of what's physically there, but in terms of what's there in regard to our interaction with a motif, but then somehow our problematic interaction with the artist himself that always ends up making the surface tension flat. Right. I wonder if you'd speak about that a little bit.
No, thank you. As you know, the cliche about modernism in painting is flatness, right? The Clement Greenberg, like the flat surface, look only at the surface. And that's one side of it, and I'm not saying that's wrong in many experimental abstract paintings, that is what it is. But to consider Munk a bit traditional because he doesn't go away from figuration is totally misunderstanding the way that he precisely doesn't want to make that opposition, and he stays with painting as we know it, and then tells us to look again and see other things, which is why I was a bit very disappointed by the captions, the wall texts in the Matt Breuer show would all point to things we already know, and then we project it into the paintings, because it's not as if recognition is not projection. Recognition is a way of saying, oh yeah, I know he was a drunkard. I know he was a misogynist. There was even a caption that suggests abuse, I think that's an abusive caption. That is totally, totally wrong. Because, first of all, there is, a painter painting a woman naked is a normal cultural phenomenon in the arts, and there is no reason to consider that more abusive than when other painters do it. And then she has a morning gown on, so at least, she is also allowed to get a little warm after the posing session. This is all the sort of crap that you get when you look at things as, oh yeah, I recognize this. What you see is, in fact, that morning gown is itself an interesting surface that sort of hides not just the nakedness of the woman, but also the three-dimensionality. So this is a case of surface tension where the flatness of the abstraction, of the beautifully painted brushstrokes, makes it impossible to just say this is a woman who just put on her morning gown because she was just being raped or something, or abused. That is the kind of thing that I want to draw attention to, that surface tension is a way of saving figuration from recognition, and therefore opening it up to the new vision that you can see. And that is why I think Munk is more radical than the abstract painters of his time, rather than less. And that I use the concept of surface tension because I don't want to say, okay, there are portions of abstraction, and then there is the figuration. Because I think they are superimposed, they are together, and it is very difficult to imagine, but try to imagine that something can be flat and three-dimensional at the same time. And that's the surface tension that does that. And I think that it makes him pretty unique. I have to say, I'm maybe idealizing Munk. I discovered this artist relatively recently when I really delved into it, and I'm just totally blown away by the way he does that. And so the clumsily painted hands are just carriers of surface tension rather than badly painted hands.
Or severed hands, for which we forget that we're watching something floating. Yeah.
Wasn't that striking, that those hands are really cut off?
We're sitting here not to have a dialogue together, but really to help to facilitate a conversation throughout the group. And I'm sure there are many questions or comments.
Someone there.
Yeah, super.
It's a big room, so it takes a while.
Thank you. Regarding surface tension, did you have any notice the effects of Munk's varnish when he originally applied it 100 years ago or 80 years ago was colorless, and today, 80 years or 100 years later, the original varnish, if it's still there and hasn't been cleaned off, has turned to a darker brown, and the structure of the application of the varnish changes now because it's old, not just making the painting dirty, but actually the physical structure. Did you see anything like that?
Well, it's a good point, and it always matters to consider what time does to the paintings. Now, in the case of Munk, we are lucky enough that we have an artist who voluntarily exposed his work to the elements, for example, and when there was mold growing on it, he let it grow, which must be a real challenge for the Munk Museum restoration department, conservation department, because what do? Are you going to clean it away? No, because then you go against the artist, but if you don't clean it away, it may destroy the whole thing. It may continue to grow, which is a way of also saying the art is alive. It literally is alive. But the varnish, you're right, this is an issue, and I've actually studied that a little bit with Caravaggio, because that's several centuries ago, and there the darkening makes even changes what you see. It really changes the figuration, and that is definitely an issue. I didn't think in this case of the painting of the self-portrait with the bottle of wine, this would be a major issue, the darkening of the varnish. But I'm not technically informed enough to decide. But there is brown, there is green with black, and there is orange that I think wouldn't change if you replace the varnish by a new one.
Could I add one tiny little thing? Could I just add one little thing to it? And we have Gerd Wahl sitting here in the room who's looked at every surface of every painting. But Munk, when it was his choice, eschewed varnish in many, many of his works. Sometimes they were varnished by other hands, not his own. And one of the things I think that you've noted is the fact that there's a lot of canvas that operates as part of the surface as well, which is also one of the things that you note as surface tension. So the question about varnish is a really interesting one, but not in the old master way that we might think about it.
There's one there. It's difficult. It's such a big room.
Your analysis of Monk in front of the bottle reminded me of self-portrait in Hell with the background being orange. Did you think about that when you were tuning into the orange?
Yeah, I showed it in one slide as an indication that orange and fire are connected in Munk. But again, self-portrait in Hell, the fire is sort of above him, not below. So it's not like someone on the stake. It really is someone who is surrounded by hell. Yeah, no, that's actually a very, very beautiful companion piece for this one. And it also is in the Matt Breuer. Yeah, well, but this is where I don't want to go. And I don't know if you noticed this. I haven't seen any commentary mentioning it. But they say he was a drunkard, he was drinking, and that's why he was so lonely. And maybe in hell, but the bottle is full and the glass is empty. What do you make of that? So it's not an after-drinking loneliness. The bottle is full and nobody notices that. But look again and you will see it. There's someone there. Oh.
Oh, that was an incredible talk. I'm really fascinated by the dynamic or the tension between accessibility and blindness or inattention. I mean, first of all, I don't look at Munk, so that's one of those things where I thought I've already seen him. And I think most people who don't go deeply into the artist feel like they already know what the artist's work is. So could you speak to that just a little bit more?
Yeah. No, this is the great thing about that conception of abstraction as trying to blind yourself for what you think you know. You know it, you think you know it. And with someone like Munk, who is so famous and so over-biographized, it is really important to get out of that. And how do you do that? Because it's true. I mean, he has so many different things and thousands of works, and yet you immediately recognize a Munk. I just recently in an auction I saw a little head of a boy, nothing to do with any of Munk's motifs, and totally strange, and you immediately see it's a Munk. So, but knowing that it's Munk is not the same as knowing that he was a drunkard, knowing that he was a misogynist, that he abused women, and all those things that we don't know. Some of the things, yes, you know, and because he was open about it. But other things we think we know. And this is why I keep looking at the depictions of empathic, compassionate figurations, like the puberty, where I think that it's much more ambivalent than the usual vision of it. So it is difficult with Munk to unknow him and to distance yourself from what you think you know. And that is why I was paying so much attention to the surface and the surface tension, because I want you to look at it, at the materiality as much as the figuration. And if you look at the figuration through that materiality, then you have maybe blinded yourself enough from recognizing that you can actually see something new. And like in this, the self-portrait with the bottle of wine, I think that there is this, he's being pushed to the edge towards us. This is another way of soliciting some form of identification that is not based on sentimentalizing compassion with someone who's lonely. It's his own fault because he drank too much, but it's really compassionate. No, just think about how close that comes to you. And then you have a different sense of compassion because you are implicated. So we have to work hard to unknow Munk. And I think he deserves it.
Thank you for your talk. You're arguing for a new approach and at the same time the uniqueness of Munk in contrast to his contemporaries by focusing on empathy and giving agency thus to the viewer. And as someone who studies the 19th century, I'm reminded of the importance of empathy to thinkers and artists during the second half of the 19th century. For example, Vernon Lee writing on classical sculpture, William James in 1884 asking what is an emotion, and then of course Henri Bergson thinking much about emotion and time and free will in 1889, where he encourages us to think about our emotional worlds and also talks about art in particular. And of course, emotion was so important to the symbolists. So I was wondering if we were to trace such a lineage, how might this add or change your argument?
Yeah, well, you're provoking me into a sort of genealogical reasoning that I'm trying to resist because I think that it kind of flattens the issues. Of course, there was a lot of thinking in philosophy and in other media about emotion. And I think emotion is important in Munk, very. But it isn't as if he was illustrating a philosophy of emotion at all. On the contrary, as I have tried to argue, the emotions get a completely different status when they are embedded in the surface tension. Henri Bergson also is the philosopher who says that the image is in the present tense and that you cannot see an image in another tense than the present. But that perception, and perception is a selection and not a projection, the selection that you make looking at the world and at art as in the present only makes sense if you fill it with memories. And I think that is an important issue, and Bergson really beautifully articulates that. If you don't have memories, you cannot make sense of anything. Then it becomes all totally abstract in a way that would not have any meaning emotionally. But it also implies, this vision that Bergson puts forward of the image, also implies that every act of looking is different according to who is doing the looking, because you have the memories, and your memories are different from someone else's memories. But then the image is the place, the site, where you can actually socially meet, encounter others, because you have different... This is why it's so beautiful to have discussions about what you see. Everybody will see something else, and the emotions are different from each of us, and some would say, oh, that's repulsive, and others would say, oh, how wonderful and attractive. And so it's very difficult to make a selection of images about attraction. For this reason, we were discussing this today, because precisely it is individual and different for everyone. I'm very cautious with genealogies, also because Munk was absolutely a learned and readerly person, and I'm sure there's a lot of literature in his work, but he is not a colleague of William James and Henri Bergson. He is not a philosopher. He's a visual philosopher, you could say. But it's not the same as an influence. The word influence is something that I really want to keep at bay also.
I would like to offer that we perhaps have time for one or two more questions. And then there's going to be an opportunity, there's a reception following this, so there's an opportunity to have more discussion. Yeah? Does that seem right to you?
Yeah, it seems right. I'm just looking at this watch, but it's a bit blinding. I can't see, can't read my watch.
A very short question. In the wedding party, the vessel on the table reminded me of Matisse. Would you agree?
Well, yeah, you could say that. You could say that, but it's still it also has other connotations, right? Like the snake and the seductive snake. But yes, I think there is a lot of allusions to Matisse rather than imitations of Matisse. Yeah, no, it's totally possible. Yes.
Yes, thank you for a very inspiring talk. I wanted to go back to this preposterous history writing. I mean, I think it's a very interesting approach, and also something that, particularly with these images that we've seen so much, and we think we know what we see, and it can be like a very fruitful way of approaching them. But there's also been like some criticism of this method, and I mean, there's been like people like Hal Foster who talk about this pseudomorphism and just putting things together that look alike but don't have anything to do with each other. And I was wondering if you could comment on like the criticism of this anachronistic or preposterous history writing, and also like if you see like some limits to it, or if you think that you should just really like follow whatever you can find in this way.
No, yeah, you're right. Of course, no method is mechanical. So you cannot say that there is an unlimited, and certainly not a formalistic one. I think that the criticism would be addressing cases where you say, oh, this is the same form as that, and therefore that's the screen through which you see the older art. No, I wouldn't do that. I think that what I did in my book on Caravaggio and contemporary art is, in fact, bringing a dialogue, because I think this is why I was insisting on this deixis. It is mutual. You first, like Svetlana Alpers and Michael Baxendale said, you cannot see Cézanne. No, you can only see old masters through Cézanne, and this work with perspective. And it's true that their vision and this whole idea of looking at perspective as from later art, and then say, has alerted us to the artificiality of linear perspective in Old Master art and Renaissance art. And so it's no longer a question of reconstructing scientifically whether the perspective is correct or not, but it becomes another artifice that is trying to fool us into believing something. I would never make it a formalistic. I'm not against looking at form at all. I do it all the time. I think it's important. But it's not formalistic, which is giving meaning to the fact that something looks the same as something else. So I would say that criticism is not addressed to preposterous history in itself or to anachronism, but to the mechanical application. And I think any method that's mechanically applied is doing the art, is failing the art. That's my, general. There's
well, I think one of the most interesting things tonight that you've enlightened me is the idea that in his paintings of perspective pulling forward.
Yeah.
That white tablecloth is pulling forward. The men, as they're walking, they're going forward. So often perspective takes us back.
Yes. And that's the difference between the Renaissance perspectivists and Caravaggio. Because Caravaggio I think he sort of invented that, that deployment of light colors and black colors having this different dynamic with space. But of course, we can only see that in relation to other forms of perspective. And I think that Munch's exaggerated perspective, because he makes almost a parody of it with these high triangular things, is a way of showing it as art, as artifice, and not as reality. And that is what makes it so incredibly powerful as a case of surface tension. Triangular, and then the two people or children coming out of the frame, also with triangular faces. So here is a formal similarity between the faces and the perspective. And that's a bit crazy. That's not what perspective is for in the traditional scientific reconstruction of it. Yeah.
At this point, I think does it feel to you like a good time to? This is the conversation's getting in the way of our having a glass of wine together. I think all of us.
That is bad.
But I would like to just again thank you. But before you clap, I want to say something quite banal, but I also think incredibly important that you're bringing to us. Which is not just about blindness, but mutilation. And you began with the image of the scream as a little reflector hanging on a Christmas tree, in which there's an integral composition that we no longer see as integral with the separable figure, which is a kind of mutilation. And I would also add, given the sensitivity that you're bringing to this idea of surface tension, surface itself, and the multiple surfaces that appear and disappear in so many of Munch's works, that looking at it on a screen potentially is a form of mutilation as well. So thank you for the
I couldn't
great
bring
reminder.
the paintings, I'm sorry. They didn't let me.
Not your screen, our little computer, our little handhelds. Anyway, thank you so much, Mieke, for a phenomenal talk.